Hello and welcome to today's webinar covering the 2023 Cloud Protection Trends Report. This special webinar event is presented in partnership with our friends at Veeam. This is part of the Veeam Trailblazer Talks series. Thank you so much for joining us on this webinar produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is David Davis of Actual Tech Media, and I'll be serving as the host and moderator on the event today. We always want these events to be educational. We know everyone out there is dealing with challenges around data protection and disaster recovery and security and ransomware, and especially, protecting data in the cloud. And that's what this event is all about. So we encourage your questions here on the event. We will be doing our best to answer your questions, and we encourage you to check out the questions pane there in your audience console. And many of you have already said hello and good afternoon and howdy. We appreciate that. And we, however, do want your technical questions on the event today. That is our best way to get your feedback and to help you to solve your challenges in the world of cloud protection. We also want to encourage you to check out the handouts tab there. It's there that you'll find a link right at the top to download the 2023 Cloud Protection Trends Report. Strategies for protecting infrastructure as a service, SaaS as a service, platform as a service, including backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service. All the services there are covered in the report. So make sure that you check it out. It's an excellent resource. And then finally, at the end of the event today, I'll be announcing the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. If you're watching this on demand, of course, that drawing would have already occurred. The prize terms and conditions can be found there in the handouts tab. And then, as I mentioned, we encourage your questions on the event. So we also have a best question prize to help maybe shake some of those questions loose. If you're thinking, I'm not sure if I should ask this question, ask away and you will be entered into the drawing for the best question prize. This is for an additional $50 Amazon gift card. We'll be selecting the prize winners after the event to give us a chance to review those questions. And you must, of course, still meet the Actual Tech Media prize terms and conditions. All right, so with that housekeeping information out of the way, I'm excited to bring in now today's two expert presenters. Welcome to Jason Buffington, Vice President for Solution Strategy at Veeam, and Mr. Dave Russell, Vice President of Enterprise Strategy, also from Veeam. Jason and Dave, it's great to have you on. This is going to be an awesome event. I'll now hand it off to you. Take it away.
Hello and welcome to a readout of Veeam's Cloud Protection Trends for 2023. Jason and I and all of Veeam are happy to share this data with you ahead of actually the year 2023. But what we're going to talk through, Jason, is not just Veeam specifics or even Veeam data, it's industry data, isn't it?
Yeah, so this particular project, we went out to a third-party research firm, so this is not, Veeam customers, and they surveyed 1,700 different types of IT administrators that have something to do with as a service, either in production or protection. In fact, you can look at the QR code in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. You can grab that URL if it's more convenient. But really, one of the core design goals was to understand, do these different personas agree on how data protection, or if data protection should be conducted or not. And you can see on the pie on the right-hand side, we've got several hundred IaaS administrators, some PaaS administrators, some SaaS administrators, some IT operations generalists, and of course, some backup administrators as well. And so with those 5 personas all having different points of view, that kind of framed out the research project itself. So what we'll look at today is actually just a very high-level view on several of those, including infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, specifically looking at files and databases. Software as a service, certainly the poster child for that is Microsoft 365 or Office 365 if you're a traditionalist. And then on the protection side, backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service, as well as looking at some of the key considerations for managed service providers that are offering BaaS and DRaaS outcomes. For most organizations, when they first embrace cloud for production purposes, it's by leveraging infrastructure as a service. And what I mean by that is literally taking either images of physical servers from the data center or VMs within the data center, and simply saying, instead of running them on my own metal within the data center, I'm going to run them on cloudy metal, infrastructure as a service. But it's important to recognize that not all of these are migration scenarios. It's not. And in fact, we know that within a normal data center, you're not decommissioning workloads from physical or virtual at 30% over years. So what we're seeing is that while a majority of platforms may be coming from what was physical or what was virtual, what's really happening is the data center is getting diluted because as organizations really do take a cloud-first approach, they're starting more in the cloud and they are decommissioning over there, and that's resulting in a dilution, which I think is the right approach for a cloud-first strategy. It also certainly means, though, that we're not talking about the demise of the data center. Okay, so that's how they get started. But let's make sure we know that the journey to the cloud is not always just a one-way trip, right? So organizations were actually asked, have you ever brought workloads back? Now you can see the orange wedge there says 12% have not, which means 88%, 7 out of 8 organizations have brought workloads back. And you see the scenarios on that right-hand side, one or more reasons. So some had a disaster, so they failed over to a cloud and then came back on-prem the way they always planned, like a spare tire after a flat tire on the side of the road. Other folks did have what we might call cloud remorse, right? So they sent it over to the cloud, didn't have the same performance, maybe it's too costly, whatever the math is. And then the third one, of course, is I dev'd in the cloud, but I always planned on bringing it back in. These all seem mature and reasonable parts of a justification strategy.
Yeah, it really does. It goes back to the notion that cloud means different things to different people. And from a variety of different business reasons, you may choose to have any number of cloud activities take place, part of which could, to your point, include bringing data back on-prem because that was always the intention.
Right. So yeah, one of the things I think is interesting is we hear more and more about organizations where, let's say, the developers have access to Amazon. And so they first develop the application over there. But if you happen to be a Microsoft 365 customer and your CFO says, hey, we have extra credits over in Azure, there might be the goal of saying, hey, let's move this dev'd application from one cloud to another, right? And that's not something that's going to happen if you're using just the native utilities that come from any single hyperscale. You're going to need to move that from one cloud to another. And again, so now we're talking more fluidity, right? The idea of have the right workload and the right public and or private, multi-private or multi-public. And then what's the data protection ramifications of that as these workloads might be in flux along the way? All right, so that's the landscape that we're going to try to address. It was also important for us to understand who's defining that strategy overall. The first one being who's defining the requirements for how data protection of cloud-hosted production data should be. And I like the fact it's a pretty even balance. There's a lot of cooks in the kitchen as far as how this goes.
Yeah, exactly. It's not one team dictating to another. And I think if we were to poll this, say, 3, 4 years ago, or even longer, we would see more like a cloud center of excellence that had determined the strategy, as well
Yes.
as maybe even the implementation. But here, what we're seeing is a maturation such that more of the traditional IT teams are getting more involved, even when it comes to running something in the cloud.
Yeah, so we got a lot of folks sitting around the table defining the strategy and requirements. But if you look at who's actually clicking the mouse, and I really like this slide, by the way, it turns out more often than not, it's the backup team. And this has been a significant shift over the last couple of years. There's actually 2 different ways to look at this chart. When backup as a service is also being used as the method for protecting cloud data, you see that the BaaS or DRaaS service provider team is actually responsible for managing the backup jobs themselves in about 1 out of 4 organizations. And the remainder is roughly a little over 2-to-1 ratio between the backup team and the cloud administrators team. And I like this because what it shows is that it doesn't necessarily require and mandate that the cloud admins also have to be the backup people, right? When the backup admins are actually doing the job, there's like a higher likelihood that the backups are actually getting done. By the way, when backup as a service is not part of the solution scenario, then we still see just slightly greater than 2-to-1 ratio. Again, backup team really owning the protection of the cloud hosted data the same way they protect everything else in the environment.
Yeah, again, I think it's another statement of maturity. Let the subject matter experts of protection, meaning the backup team, have greater involvement in the process.
Yeah, in fact, if you think back 15 years, back when virtualization was brand new, right? So it would be typical that you'd have some legacy backup team running just the backups for just the legacy physical servers. And then this new virtualization thing came out, and the legacy backup team didn't really understand it that well. And so the virtualization admin had to say, look, I need a different kind of backup for a different kind of production workload. And so they ended up running their own stuff over time. Now, then Veeam would come in and we backed up the VMs. And then over time, you'd say, hey, actually, you could run the same thing for everything. And then Veeam takes over protecting the physical parts of the environment. So I kind of like the idea that, for some organizations, they might have a legacy backup solution running within their data center. And maybe Veeam's backup solution for one of the cloud platforms is their first foray into leveraging Veeam as part of their data protection strategy. So it's kind of a cake and eat it too, because then what they'll figure out, just like the vAdmins did 15 years ago with the rest of the environments, that hey, Veeam backs up the rest of the environment while they're there. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. It goes back to, the Veeam platform can be distributed across specific workloads or the
Sure.
entirety of the workload. And there's no reason to make that determination at first implementation.
Okay, so we understand the landscape, right, of what's to be protected. We've looked a little bit at the who is defining strategy, the who is clicking the mouse, and this all looks pretty good. One thing that I'm hoping for is noticing how many more environments the backup team is now involved. Hopefully, that's also going to fill some of the shortcomings that we've seen in cloud-based data protection moving forward. One of those is when we asked organizations, how long are you retaining data that was originally production in a cloud-based environment? And I gotta say, Dave, this is an area where I'm a little bit troubled, right? Barely half of organizations are holding data for even 1 year, regardless of how long they typically have been holding production backups for their on-prem infrastructure.
Yeah, the concerning part here is if you buy our thesis that production workloads, business critical workloads, are being born in the cloud or lifted and shifted from on-prem to the cloud, there can very well be external and maybe even internal regulations
Sure.
specific for how long you're mandated to hold that data. And yet, here people are self reporting that their retention level probably is out of sync with that.
We ran this report in 2021. This is the 2023 version. I'm hoping that by the next time we run the report, the longer the backup team is responsible for backups, hopefully the longer that they are retaining data, because they understand that regardless of whether you keep your data on servers or within services, if you have mandates for long-term retention, you have mandates for long-term retention, and I guarantee it's longer than a year. All right, now for that data that was being held for longer than a year, we did ask, where are they storing it? Right. And I love the fact that that many organizations are doing cloud to cloud, right? So in some cases, and I'm a fan of this, is the idea of protecting cloud-based data to a backup as a service or DR as a service provider. Certainly, there are other folks that are protecting, say, from one region in their hyperscale cloud to another region or zone. There are other folks that are actually going from cloud to cloud. So from Amazon to Azure or Azure to GCP, or pick your favorite math for that. But that idea of truly having separate credentials. In theory, I guess you can have separate credentials even between zones, but you get the idea from that perspective. But I gotta admit, one of the cooler parts is take a look on the bottom of that for the on-prem scenarios related to this, Dave.
Yeah, it's hard for my eyes not to go down to the bottom of the list, meaning the last three capabilities or type of implementations listed. I like the idea of bringing this data, meaning M365 data, back on-prem because
Sure.
arguably M365 and all its various components is maybe the only, but certainly the poster child for a SaaS solution where you can go and do something with that data, meaning you can have an on-prem Outlook or a OneDrive or a SharePoint, and the list goes on. So that data is directly usable once you get it back in the data center. And then to your point on tape there at 28%, it just goes back to right tool for right task. And
That's
if
right.
you're an organization that's already made an investment in tape, great, leverage it for this long-term retention use case.
Yep. And speaking of the right tool for the right purpose, there's a lot of different ways that organizations are leveraging cloud or clouds. as part of your data protection strategy. And I kind of like the fact there's a pretty even mix here. Now, since your eye is often drawn to the bottom, why don't you break down the boundary conditions?
Yeah, if you look at the yellow and the red, the orange and red really, it's 2%. So conversely, 98% are saying that the cloud has some kind of interaction with their disaster recovery strategy. 1% said we don't use any cloud services as part of our DR. Maybe even more concerning, 1% said my organization does not have a DR strategy. That is hopefully something that gets rectified in 2023, or at least improved upon. But Jason, take us through the top four.
I like the fact that for many organizations, the first time that you probably experimented with cloud at all, you were simply adding cloud storage, right? And that's certainly true in the data protection case. Now, this is what we would call a cloud tier, but that idea of simply adding a cloud storage layer to your otherwise on-prem data protection repository, right? So now you've got this survivable copy of your data up in the cloud, and that's great. But then eventually someone gets around to saying, hey, instead of restoring that data back on-prem, why couldn't I just power it up? Right. And so that's where you see that second usage around using cloudy infrastructure as my DR site, as opposed to running multiple DR sites along the way. Now, once organizations have gotten there in their journey, many of them say, actually, I don't like being the smartest person in the room. Wouldn't I rather have somebody else driving that for me and having expertise, not just secondary infrastructure? And that's where we get into disaster recovery as a service. So we're going to cover all of those, but I got to say, I like that there's a healthy distribution here.
And speaking of distribution, this adds up to almost 200%,
Right.
meaning many organizations selected two different kind of capabilities.
So let's go back to how we talked about how workloads first kind of come on the scene when it comes to clouds, right? So we talked about cloud storage as the first step, and then that next idea in production is lift and shift, right? I take a physical image or a server VM, and I simply go and put that on cloud infrastructure. So now I've got, say, maybe Windows VMs that are running file shares, or I've got Windows VMs that are running databases, simply running on somebody else's metal. Now, from a maturation perspective, though, that isn't always the end of that journey, right? So when we talk about unstructured file data, we talk about structured databases overall. For many organizations, they found better optimization and outcomes by actually leveraging that through platform as a service as well. So let's look at the left-hand side of this for a second, is Amazon based, or if you're a Microsoft person, take a look on the right-hand side. But the math is pretty similar, right? So roughly 60+%, so let's say 3 out of 5 organizations, they're running server instances, so Windows or Linux VMs, running file shares in either Amazon EC2 or Microsoft Azure hosting. Similarly, about 50% of organizations, plus or minus 5, are running native managed file shares. Now, on the Amazon side, that's Amazon File Services. On the right-hand side, kind of put OneDrive for business and, of course, Azure File Share, Azure File Sync, etc., on that right-hand side along the way. Now, there's a lot of overlap here, but Dave, take a look at the orange and the red.
Yeah, they're a little bit higher on the Amazon side than as compared to the Azure side. Expectation would be those decrease over time.
Yep.
One possible thesis for, yes, we run on, say, OneDrive for business or file sharing from Amazon could be what we've experienced in the last roughly 2.5 years in the pandemic, when many of us anyway, had to burst into a different kind of IT model in order to handle our employee needs, especially if they were suddenly remote.
Now, this is for file services. If we look at databases, you see a very similar kind of layout here. So again, roughly 60+% running server instances with databases running inside of them. Roughly in the 40+% range, again, running those managed database services. So that's Amazon RDS or DynamoDB on the Amazon side of the house, things like Azure SQL. On the right-hand side. And by the way, when you download the Cloud Protection Trends report, we actually double-clicked into, file services? What kind of file services are you running on each side? Databases? Which kinds of databases? Is it Oracle? Is it SQL? Is it Maria, MySQL, et cetera, along the way? So be sure to take those into the result as well. So the good news is that we are seeing a very natural and pretty aggressive actually maturity model where folks are first going from lift and shift, and for where it makes sense. In fact, in some cases you have to refactor the app, et cetera. But they are moving all the way through into platform as service, and I like that idea. Right? That's the good news. The bad news is, just like we've seen in every other as a service architecture before it, some folks misunderstand that because an as a service might be durable or resilient means they don't have to back it up anymore. So that's the bad news. So Dave, take a look at some of the boundary conditions here in the red and the orange.
Yeah, the positive would be if you kind of go round clockwise, almost 60% say we are backing up using at least one service or tool, meaning they could be using multiple methods.
Sure.
Nothing wrong with that, especially for business critical data. You start going around though from, I'll say, roughly 7 to 8 o'clock on the calendar, or the clock up to midnight. It's interesting. The red says roughly 1 out of 5. Everything's fine. It's natively durable. Well, let's not confuse the availability, durability of infrastructure for the resiliency of data, your data. 15% say, well, our cloud hosted shares, they don't have data that needs to be backed up. Kind of hard from other research that we've done, Jason, to believe that anybody has unnecessary data, especially at
Yeah.
that kind of scale.
Yep.
And then 8%, hopefully they find a solution before it's too late.
Gotta say, this bothers me, right? You got 19% say not backing up, 15% says no real data. That's really hard to believe. So 34%, 1 out of 3 organizations saying they're not protecting the data within their cloud hosted file shares. Now, of the almost 60% that are backing it up, let's take a look at the how. So, and this part actually looks very similar to what we saw in virtualization 15 years ago, right? So 15 years ago, really new market overall, and VMware actually had this little VCB utility. Just dump a copy of those VMs. At least you got a copy for something, right? And this is what we're seeing here. So the Amazon or Azure native utility dumps it out. Honestly, even just a few years ago, Oracle admins or DBAs with RMAN, right? Dump and scrape, just get a copy and get it out there. And then over time, what you figure out is that dump type of utility just isn't sufficient, and you go and you lean into a third-party backup solution. So I expect that those folks relying on the utility will go down drastically over the next couple of years as they figure out it's insufficient, and they'll embrace either third-party enterprise backups or backup as service. In this case, you see it's a pretty even mix, right? 30% using a backup tool, 26% leveraging through a managed backup service. And again, I like the idea of one cloud protecting the other. That makes sense to me.
Yeah, it really does. Because one of the motivations for going to the cloud is to get out of some of the responsibilities, the infrastructure oversight, the management oversight associated with that. So why not vent out to a trusted provider as well?
Yeah, that totally makes sense to me. Now, this is unstructured file data. If you look at databases, it's a similar kind of diagram, although happily there's a little bit more good news, right? So you do see the orange and the red smaller. So we got 7 and 8, so 15% as opposed to 35. And Dave, I just kind of wonder if many organizations might assume that structured databases or applications have more of a mission criticality than just your home directories as an imperative. Maybe that's why there's a higher degree that are backing them up. Does that hold water?
Yeah, I think that is the perception. I like that modifier that you use, meaning perception. Of course, the reality is the CEO's PowerPoint, the chief financial officer's spreadsheet may have very serious business ramifications associated with those files. However, the other flip side of this might be that databases, applications oftentimes have a dedicated administrator associated with them. So it might be that there's a team actively looking out for availability.
Yep. Okay, so now let's dig in that second point again, right? So now we got 79% claiming they do protect the data within their databases. And again, we see something very similar where, again, many of them early on are embracing that built-in utility dump and scrape kind of model, like we talked about Oracle RMAN as an example. And then you do again see actually more BAS and DRAS than file. And again, I'm kind of guessing part of that is due to if I'm placing a perceived higher value on structured sophisticated databases and applications, then maybe I'm even more interested in having smarter humans, that expertise that comes from the service provider, being responsible for ensuring that backup actually happens. Okay, so we talked about infrastructure service, we talked about platform as a service. For many organizations, the Nirvana scenario is software as a service where the whole stack is now running cloud native. And certainly the poster child for software as a service is Microsoft or Office 365 along the way. So for these next few slides, we're going to look at M365, which is probably furthest down that maturation curve. Let's talk about first the boundary conditions on this one, this prolific question of, does your organization back up 365? Take a look at the boundaries, and then let's give folks some good news.
Yeah, the glass half empty, if you will, meaning the bottom three here. 3% think that Microsoft is natively resilient, don't need to do anything. That's a bit like the rental car company, guaranteeing that the car is reliable, it has gasoline, it doesn't do anything with your ability to run it off the road or make a mistake in directions, etc. Then there's 4% that said, well, we use the built-in recycle bin. That offers something, but arguably not everything that an organization's used to getting when they used to run Exchange on premises, as but an example. And then 4% are looking around. I do like the top conditions, especially when you match that 4%. That overwhelmingly means we've made a lot of progress in just a few years in terms of recognizing what needs to be done.
That's right. So one of the big questions that different Veeam surveys over the years have consistently asked the large market pool studies is just pragmatically, do you back it up at all? Right? And we have seen a really significant shift over the last, 3 years, 4 years in particular. Originally, early on, everyone assumed, oh, it's Microsoft, so surely they're backing up your stuff for you. No, they're not. It's in their EULA. It's your data. You back it up. Right? And then there are other folks that, well, it's natively resilient. When my iPhone or my device connects, it gets my mail, right? And it does. And if you delete something, it deletes it everywhere, all at the same time, right? And so there is an understanding now the need for previous versions, but I think more even that has exacerbated beyond that is with ransomware being so prolific today. And arguably with a lot of organizations that might have thought the recycle bin was good enough, and then they tried and said, oh, we needed data that was older than 14 days. I guess we can't use just those built-in functions along the way. It hasn't always worked out. So today, in this research, we see nearly 4 out of 5 organizations are leveraging a third-party backup or backup as a service technology in order to protect their Microsoft 365 environment. And in fact, when you add up the top 2, you'll notice it's well more than 100%. Look, there's a lot of great capabilities inside of E3 and the E5, those enhanced tiers, right? That have to do with security, with ID management, legal hold, e-discovery events, et cetera. It's just not a replacement for backup, right? So the fact that these two alone add up to well more than 100% means that many organizations understand these are complementary technologies to each other. They're not displacing each other. One is backup, the other isn't.
Yeah, and maybe one thing that comes to mind on that orange, that 4%, meaning the recycle bin, that can be quote unquote valid, meaning give you a good result if you're going to bring back just a finite amount of data in a fairly recent amount of time. However, if you've actually had to bring a large installation back, meaning not just a contact, an email, but the entire server for email, an entire OneDrive, that's not very easy to do with the recycle bin. There's a lot more glue that's required from an administrator perspective to try to make that happen versus what a backup tool can do for you.
So these are the methods. And again, I like the fact that some organizations are leveraging both enhanced tiers and third-party products because they understand that they don't compete with each other in that space. We also did want to look at the personas involved, and kind of like what we saw earlier with infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, you see a pretty even balance on that left-hand side of those organizations responsible for defining the requirements. It is interesting that the M365 admins, and that really is a different kind of beast, is kind of top of mind for defining those requirements. They do understand that app better than any of the other personas that are there. Remember, one of the key design criteria for this project was making sure do all the different personas agree on how this works. And in fact, so the same question on the right-hand side, we simply cut out the what do the M365 admins, the SaaS admins think in the bluish green, and then what do the backup admins in the yellowish green? Do they agree or disagree? And really the only time that you see any real significant gap is in their perspective towards the central IT team, which is usually sitting at the head of the table. But in this case, while the backup admins still see them at the head of the table, the M365 admins don't see them as much. And Dave, this kind of feels like one of those many times when the app owner says, I know better than those generalists do along the way. Well, that's really the only gap I see here.
Yeah, you're right. And the good news is, meaning the other four of these that are called out, it's pretty well aligned, which shows that we're getting some consensus.
Now, moving on, what we see here is the balance of who's defining the strategy. Just like in the last survey question on IaaS and PaaS, we also looked at who's clicking the mouse. And you do see on that wedge on the pie on that left-hand side, again, when backup as a service is being used to protect M365, that service provider team is responsible for about 1 in 4 of managing and monitoring the backup jobs. For the other majority of the percentage, it's a little less than 2 to 1, as opposed to slightly greater than 2 to 1 like it was for IaaS and PaaS. And frankly, that makes sense to me too, because if you haven't tried to actually configure data protection for M365, there's some extra stuff you got to go through on roles and controls and Graph API, and there's just more to it. Right. And so it makes sense to me that there's still a slightly higher portion of M365 admins that are actually running those backups while they're there along the way. Again, I think as the tools, including the platform M365 itself, continues to mature, that'll get better for us. Now, take a look on the right-hand side, Dave, because this is where we actually get 2 gaps. There's the data center backup team. So do the M365 folks and the backup folks, who do they think is doing these backups overall? The M365 folks think the backup team is doing backups more often than the backup team thinks they're doing backups. And so that can get into some finger pointing, right?
Yeah, it's a bit like if those are familiar with baseball, 2 outfielders running into each other yelling yours, meaning neither one of them think that they've got it. So that's a case of where there's a potential for an escape that you only learn about after the fact, meaning once you've experienced potential data loss. That's really the only area of the 3 where I think we'd like to see that smooth out.
Yeah. There is another gap on this. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll notice that the backup team thinks that the BaaS provider is doing it perhaps more than M365. And I like that gap, right? Because that actually shows good partnering, right? The M365 folks say, oh, the BaaS team isn't really that involved. Well, actually, the backup team knows that's actually more common. But if you're doing good partnering and you have a good service provider, they should be almost acting transparently like an extension or an outsourcing of your team. And so it's okay that the app owner doesn't see that as often as the backup team that's actually responsible for those jobs does. So I like the gap on the right, not so keen on the gap on the left. So one of the other areas we wanted to look at was understanding not only do the different personas agree or disagree on who's running the backups, but why they're running the backups along the way. Go back to that earlier example when we were picking on the Oracle database admins along the way. Back then, if you talk to an Oracle person, they would typically think, I got to make sure I have backups for a day, a week, couple weeks, a month, because if I do a bad import or something like that, I got to be able to fix it and get back into production again. It's all around data integrity. There's a lot of other reasons to back up data, right? And so when we asked organizations, or the third-party research company asked organizations about why do you back up 365, the 2 personas actually do agree, right? So cyber is top of mind, compliance and regulations comes in. I like that. I think they got it right, Dave.
Yeah, I really do as well. And the notion here again is reasons to back up M365 in this case add up to well over 100%. Yep. So there's a variety of things that can still go wrong, even in a software as a service implementation. If you look at the top, Jason, those are arguably human related, meaning bad actor at the top, cyber, or regulatory requirements there at number 2. But I like the bottom one. Tell us about that.
So I like the fact that for the most part, everybody agrees on the top three reasons overall. It's probably worth also looking on the bottom when we look at things like migration. Now, backup admins, they have been trained from birth that, the last thing you do before you do a migration is you make sure you got a good backup, right? And you should. Absolutely, that's true. That said, would I do a backup of my on-prem Exchange server and then restore that as my method of migrating my mail messages into Exchange Online? Probably not. Would I do it necessarily for file services and file shares? Maybe. Right. So yeah, it makes sense to me that that the backup team probably puts more weight on data protection as a migration method than necessarily the SaaS folks probably have something a little bit clearer in mind for that. I will point out though, probably my favorite part of this, and it's a little bit leading, is the number two for both sets of organizations is this idea of regulatory compliance, right? And so we did actually double click into that as far as do you have mandates at all for that. I was a little surprised to find out that 36% of organizations say they don't have mandates. And I think maybe that's because the question was asked around, do you have mandates around 365? If you had asked, do you have any regulatory mandates for your email? Do you have any mandates for your unstructured file data? I think those numbers probably would have been higher because I'm going to tell you, I don't think there's 46% of the organizations in the world that don't have some kind of a mandate for attention, whether it's geo, whether it's sovereign, whether it's industry. That just doesn't make sense to me from that perspective. Dave, you spent a lot of time talking with enterprises in particular around regulatory mandates. What do you see around this, and how do we help convince folks that some of them got it wrong on this question?
Yeah, to your point, Jason, this is speaking about implementation, not what you do with the data, what you're expected to be doing with the data. So one way to work backwards from this, if you had a subpoena or a request for discovery for
Sure.
any reason, what
Yep.
would you have to produce? And to your point, you would have to assume there's a high likelihood that emails and potentially files and other things could be requested, just as if you were in an on-prem implementation.
That's exactly right. Our friend and colleague within Veeam's Office CTO, Jeff Reichard, our VP of compliance, and also, so he speaks to this in the private sector, in the public sector. You should definitely check out some of the stuff that he's written on these topics as well. All right, so left-hand side shows whether or not they had any mandates or not. On the right-hand side showed where do you store stuff that does have a long-term retention requirement. No real surprise here. For M365, yeah, many folks are going to put their data, their backups into Microsoft Azure storage along the way. I do think it's important that organizations realize that just because you're protecting Microsoft 365 and you might be running, Veeam backup for M365 in a Microsoft Azure hosted VM, and then you're storing it in Azure Blob storage. I mean, so that's a lot of Microsoft, but please do not assume that you're talking about, say, three server instances that are running in the same rack or in racks that are adjacent to each other within the same location. So there's a lot more separation than you think there. That being said, one area of separation that you do want to think about when you're doing that is credential separation to make sure that that if the 365 credentials are compromised, it doesn't affect the backup instance or the backup repository storage as well along that way. Again, also looking at the right-hand side, common theme here. Love the fact that we're still seeing backup as a service, protecting that M365 environment. There's a lot of Veeam cloud providers out there doing that today. I think that's a good thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it really does. Because as we'll see later on, some cases, what you're really getting there is some expertise, some assistance, in addition to storing the data, meaning a repository. And then, as we look down the list, not the bottom, but number 3 and number 4, that idea of bring it back to the data center because we can use that. We can
Yep.
stand that up if we need to. And again, if you've made an investment in tape, especially for longer term retention, hard to argue against those economics.
So we've talked a lot about, protecting one cloud with another cloud. So we're going to double click into that for the next part of the research, and that was looking at backup as a service and also disaster recovery as a service. And honestly, one of the first big questions is, for many people, backup as a service can mean different things. So we've asked this question in a couple of years, and it's actually been pretty enlightening to see how some of the shifts in the definition have evolved over time. Like in many questions that we have, the long lines is respondents could choose all they wanted, and then the short yellowish green lines are choose what's most important overall. Dave, let's go look at the bottom of the list first. And there's a couple interesting findings there, and then we'll double click into what's most important.
Yeah, if you look at the very bottom there, reduce on-site hardware, that's not necessarily the case or the desire, meaning I, as an organization, may not mind if there's hardware. We can talk in a moment about why that could be very favorable.
Sure.
But we just, as an organization, may not want to be managing that, racking and stacking that, patching it, day in, day out kind of operation. So it's not about close down my data center. It's really about I don't want to be as involved in the daily activity.
Totally agree. Right. So bottom of the list, you shouldn't expect necessarily that you want to remove all that hardware. There's some great SLAs that you get by having on-site hardware. Maybe just some people just don't want to manage it. Right. Second from the bottom, early on, a lot of cloud backup solutions said no more need for tape. Right. That's a bad idea. Right. So I like the fact that a lot of organizations today do recognize that tape still has value, or at least that backup as a service is not necessarily a tape killer. Right. Now, should you be using tapes to protect or retain 80 or 90% of your data? Probably not, right? Is there 20 or 30% that does have a 10-year, 20-year life of patient, life of patent type model? Yes. And for that, total cost of ownership wise, I put my money on tape for that kind of thing. In fact, I'm a fan of when backup as a service providers use tape as an output as an additional billable type of event along the way. So let's take a look at, though, there is actually one really big upswing in this particular research. So take a look at the second line on the area. So it's the second most common. It is the most defining criteria. A lot of organizations say that BAS means that the original backup software manufacturer is the one who's delivering that cloud service. Admittedly, Veeam doesn't think so. Right? We think that you lose empathy and the subscriber simply becomes a number at that point. Dave, we are unapologetically 100% channel driven on this. How do you talk to this?
Yeah, part of what we'll see in DRAS, disaster recovery, is what you're getting in addition to other things. I mean, the people managing this is expertise.
Yes.
And expertise comes in a variety of forms. We have a program we call Veeam Cloud and Service Providers. Some of them are very, very specific. And Jason's heard me give this example, but I think it holds up, which is in the United States, specifically the U.S. Northeast, which gets a variety of different weather conditions, sometimes rain, literally sometimes hurricane, obviously snow, but we have a provider that majors in that region, also majors in a vertical that happens to be dental offices. So not only do they understand the uniqueness or potential threats associated with that geography, they understand the business requirements, the day in, day out operations, or aspirations of a dentist office, which largely does not have dedicated IT. So you need to have someone that really can help determine what is best for you. And we can take that out on a regional level in some cases, while the large hyperscalers are working on getting more and more data centers for data sovereignty. There can be valid reasons why a regional provider understands your specific vertical or can guarantee that we won't have data leaving, say, Canada, whatever the requirement may be.
In Europe for GDPR, Japan has JCO. Yeah, there's a long list of different regulations and mandates, and actually having some expertise in those just makes sense to me overall. And you're never going to have that more than folks that live and breathe in those same environments, have those boots on the ground, et cetera. I mean, I've been in data protection for 32 years. When I first got started, I was with a little channel partner, a little reseller in Dallas, Texas. And as that local partner, if anything breaks, I was the first one to get the call. And so wouldn't it be nice if I was also the one who happened to have equal access to that data so I could start your restores for you as soon as things actually went bad? So I like the fact that we're channel driven. Okay, so along with arguing about the definitions and seeing how that aligns overall with expectations, we did look a little closer at why organizations are leveraging backup as a service instead of, say, managing their own backup hardware and software. Same thing for DR as a service. We'll look at that in a second. But Dave, I just want to point out a couple of things in the bottom of the slide. These last couple around costs. Right, our boss is Danny Allen, famous for saying, the cloud is not a charity. Right, so backup as a service is not guaranteed, or hardly ever actually, going to be absolutely cheaper than running your own solution, but you are very likely going to get significantly more value out of that. Fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So this isn't, to your point, we're doing a little myth busting here. This isn't about we want to kill tape. It isn't about we just want to save money, regardless of what that outcome may be.
Sure.
Free backup that doesn't offer reliable recovery is not necessarily a good return on investment. And, if we look across this list, you can see there are a variety of other good reasons why you might want to exploit this. But some of the initial reasons that we used to talk about in the industry, say 5, 6, 7 years ago, those aren't as important anymore.
I just have to laugh. When you said free backup without reliability, I just keep thinking of those old signs that says free puppy, right? Puppies are never free. Right, I promise you will pay for that puppy in the long run, even if you didn't pay for anything or hardly anything up front along the way. All right, so this was backup as a service. Let's look at disaster recovery as a service. Now, you can think about it this way. With backup as a service, what they were really looking for was operational efficiency, data survivability, right? It was tactical. For disaster recovery service, DRaaS, it's much more strategic in this case. I think it also comes down to better outcomes, right? So, in fact, if you've followed me on Twitter, I got a coffee mug that says, why BAS when you can DRaaS, right? The idea of not just restoring data back down, but actually doing something with it and just lighting it up from there along the way. So it's not just about survivable data, it's about better agility. But if you take a look at the top of the list, everything seems to be around those differentiators is not necessarily the plumbing, it's the expertise, right? And I think folks got it right.
Yeah, absolutely. Until cyber really came along, backup was largely limited to restoring 3 to 5% of your data
Sure.
that you backed up. And meaning in a 1 year period, you generally only restored 3 to 5% of your data. Now, you didn't know which data and you didn't know which time.
Right.
However, most disasters are broader in scope, and meaning that there is more data involved. It's higher potential for your on-premises equipment could be compromised as well. So it brings in new kinds of skill sets, including such things as networking
Sure.
and things of which the traditional backup experts may not be as well versed as those that are involved in a full-on business continuity disaster recovery plan.
I was on a CIO panel a few weeks ago, and one of the things we talked about is the differences in skill sets and mindsets between backup professionals and disaster recovery professionals, right? So you're a backup admin, you're focused on making copies of my stuff and making sure those copies are immutable, protectable, survivable, whatever you want to think about from all the different kinds of bad things that can happen, right? When you think about what disaster recovery professionals and experts have to think about, they think first about what is the organization's business processes, what IT systems are they dependent on, what's necessary to resume those IT systems so that the business processes can continue to persevere. I mean, it's just a very different skill set over time. And candidly, most backup admins don't have those latter skills, right? In fact, even many BaaS only providers don't have those skills. You're really looking for a subset of organizations that really can spell BCDR, right? Who really understands both the operational and business side, as well as the deep expertise necessary to not only restart technology someplace else, but even rehome it onto different infrastructure like DRaaS as a platform or infrastructure as a service as alternative media along the way. So one of the last questions that we're going to cover today, this is actually new to the 2023 version of the research, was looking at the customer journey around cloud-powered data protection, storage versus a managed backup service. So we asked organizations, did you start with storage? Did you start with BaaS? And did you switch? Did you stay put? So let's look at today. About 42%, call it 2 out of 5 organizations, leveraging cloud storage in complement to their otherwise on-prem backup solution, whereas 58%, so call it 3 out of 5 organizations, are using PaaS in some way, managed backup services overall. But I don't think that's actually the headline. The headline is looking at the momentum and shift. 30% of organizations started with one modality and stayed with it, right? So 10% started with managed BaaS, kept on going. 20% started with managed clouds or started with cloud storage, kept on going. But take a look at the 70% of organizations that switched from one mode to the other. I think that's the headline.
Yeah, I really do too. And it speaks to data fluidity, but also flexibility in the implementation model. So it can be valid reasons to switch on either direction, meaning you might have just started thinking, I just need a target, I need a location, a destination. However, now that I have more confidence in that, I feel definitely like I can go trust a provider to go and take on more of that capability. Although conversely, someone may have said, you know, we were trying to get our heads around this. We had a cloud center of excellence. It was very different and new to our organization. Now, a few years later, it's not so different and new. In fact, this seems part and parcel of our traditional infrastructure teams, our backup administrators in particular. So, what I like about this is it goes back to what makes sense and at what time for your business.
Totally agree. The only other thing I'm going to point out is take a look at the ratios within those switched, right? So nearly 2-to-1 ratio, one direction versus the other. We got 22% said they started with managed BaaS and said, we can do it ourselves, and went over to cloud storage, right? Greater than 2-to-1, that ratio. 48% said they started with cloud storage and then went to managed BaaS. And I kind of think part of that is, okay, so I got my data to the cloud, things are working okay, but I'm not really getting the value out of it that I want. Or maybe now that I trust the cloud, can't I just let somebody else do it, right? So think about it like the pilot's the one who gets the plane off the tarmac all the way up to altitude and then says, okay, we're up here. Maybe I don't want to manage these screens anymore. I'm going to hand it to the co-pilot or maybe just click autopilot, right? I want to be out of that part of the space. So I think that 2-to-1 ratio, that switch, in fact, think about it this way. The other thing is half. Right, 48% started with cloud storage. We talked about that as that entry point for almost every cloud adoption trend, and yet they ended up in managed backup as a service before they were done. All right, one last data point for today. So this is actually a question that we asked in the cloud report for 2021, and there's actually been a pretty heavy shift. Right. So the question was, what kind of service do you expect? Who's going to be running all of this when it's said and done, and you're using a service provider? Now, if you saw the 2021 report, this was 13% up to 31. So it's not a typo. Those two digits really did flip. So instead of 1 out of 8 organizations saying, I want the MSP to run it, now it's nearly 1 out of 3. Okay. Similarly, it was like 63%-ish said that, no, I'm still going to run everything. I just want that other platform to be there. Now that's swung down to that 46%. So we're seeing a pretty heavy shift, 15 points on each of those directions-ish or more. And then, by the way, 25% neutral along the way. I'm intrigued by that trend, and I think it still speaks to what we saw in that last slide of I want more value, I want more expertise, I want better outcomes. I don't want to be the smartest person in the room. Dave, what are you seeing?
Yeah, it's very consistent, very similar, meaning we did a crawl, walk, run approach, which I think from a risk perspective makes a lot of sense. Let's get some experience. We're not going necessarily all in initially, most of us anyway. So let's get some experience. Let's have some oversight on that. Trust but verify is a phrase that comes to mind. But now what we're seeing is a couple of years later, okay, I have confidence that I can turn this over to an actual service provider. You can give me a dashboard or a report or something like that, but I believe that you can deliver what you're saying you're going to be able to do.
Amen. Amen. Now, just to kind of put a fine point on that last element, take a look in the lower right-hand corner of this. Now, again, same question, cut by the two personas overall. When the IT operations generalists, right, they got several different hats they wear. One of them might be backup versus the backup admins. The backup admins were actually more likely to say, I want the BaaS third-party managed service team to do it than even the backup admins themselves, and that's their job. Right? Because even they get, hey, a BaaS team is going to, the BaaS service provider, they're going to be better at it, right? I just want to be able to hold them accountable, set those expectations, and let somebody else drive the ship from there. So with all that in mind, I think that's kind of the last piece of data for us to talk about today. Dave, any last words of wisdom?
No, thank you everyone for tuning in. I would just say you owe it to yourself to take advantage of this free research, industry-wide research, to be able to use as air cover in your activities within your organization, or to be able to potentially consider some new things in terms of the state of reality of cloud capabilities as it pertains to backup today and production workloads.
Awesome. Well, really excellent presentation. I learned so much. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Dave. And of course, thank you to our friends at Veeam. I encourage you to check out the handouts tab there. It's there that you'll find a link to the 2023 Cloud Protection Trends Report that we went into great detail on during this webinar. So I encourage you to check that out, download it for yourself, share it with your friends and colleagues. And of course, thank you to our experts again from Veeam. Before we wrap up the event today, I do want to announce the winner of our Amazon $300 gift card. Let's see, this one is going out to Samantha Fraga from Oregon. Congratulations to Samantha Fraga from Oregon. I hope everyone learned a lot on the webinar today. Visit veeam.com for more information. They have so many great resources over there when it comes to data protection and disaster recovery. We encourage you to support them in all that they do. Thank you to the Actual Tech Media audience for being on the webinar today. We'll see you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.